What's up guys, hope you're having a good day. In this video we're going to be breaking down all of the main card fights from UFC 273. We're going to be taking a deep dive into each of these fights on the main card from a betting perspective, and I hope that you're going to be able to use the information in this video to make better betting decisions and maybe even earn some extra cash. And if you like my research and analysis that I'm going to be sharing with you for each of the fights on the main card, don't forget that you can also watch video breakdowns of mine for all the other fights on this card, all of the prelim matchups, over on my website, MMABettingTips.com. You can see it in the background here. I'll also leave a link to it in the description below. On MMABettingTips.com, every single week, for every single UFC event, I post a breakdown video going into a lot of depth on every single UFC fight that ever takes place. On top of that, you'll also find a VIP chat room which you can use to communicate with me on a daily basis. I'm in there like 8 to 16 hours a day. I bloody live in that chat room, so if you ever want to ask me any questions about specific fighters, specific fights, betting theory, betting strategy, that's usually the best place to find me. And on top of that, on my website, you'll also find a wide range of bets on MMA, everything from over-under bets, prop bets, regular money line bets. My live betting group is sold out at the moment, but all the pre-fight stuff is there. Pretty much all of it is profitable, and I think you'll like it a lot. So head on over to my website, check it out. But it is very important to gamble responsibly. This is not financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor, and it's really important that you do your own research and really put a lot of thought into whether gambling is right for you, whether you want to bet sports, and whether the bets that you're placing are smart bets. Now, it is important to gamble responsibly. Obviously, I've got to make that very clear in this video. But what I can also say is that I do bet on MMA for a living. I've been doing it for a very long time. I put a lot of work into researching these fights, and so the information that I'm going to be sharing with you in this video and all of my videos comes from a good place. There's a lot of time, a lot of experience, and a lot of hard work that has gone into what I'm going to share with you here. So do your own research, gamble responsibly, use the information I'm sharing with you as a resource, but at the same time, I've got a lot of experience in this, so hopefully there's some good quality information in this video for you, which will hopefully help you make some good betting decisions this weekend. So the first fight that I want to talk about in today's video is going to be the heavyweight matchup between Oleinik and Jared Vanderaa. Now, I'm not too sure if this fight is going to be on the main card, because at the time of recording, there was only 4 fights announced for the main card after the Kelvin Gastelum Adriku Duplessis fight was cancelled. So I picked the Jared Vanderaa Oleinik fight to talk about because I feel it is one of the most interesting fights on the card, and potentially one of the fights that is the best on the card for betting. So hope you're happy with me picking this one to go through. So we'll start off by taking a look at the odds. As you can see, both guys are in that even money odds range. If you shop around, you can bet both guys at pretty much the same odds, which is around about 1.91, which is minus 110 for an implied probability of 52%. Now, if you know me well, if you've been watching my content for a long time, you'll know that I absolutely love to research fights in this odds range, and I absolutely love to bet fights in this odds range, because when you can bet both fighters at virtually the same odds in that pick'em odds range, where both guys have an implied probability of roughly 50-50, if you can just lean 60-40 one way or the other, you can find a really strong position to put your money. Now, if you can confidently lean 60-40 one way or the other, which is a very reasonable thing to do, because if you're doing a lot of research, quite often you can determine which guy is more likely to win than the other, which helps you lean in that 60-40 direction. Even though if you're capping someone, if you're giving someone a 60% chance of winning, they're not going to win a super high percentage of the time, right? Having a 60% chance of winning, not that much better than having a 50% chance of winning. So you're still taking on a lot of risk when you're betting on these guys. You cap roughly of having a 60% chance of winning, but that 60% chance that you give them of winning gives you a really big margin over the bookies. With this implied probability in the even money odds range of being 52%. That gives you a nice 8% margin over the bookies. So while you will lose a lot of bets that you cap as having a 60% chance of winnings, like I say, 60% is not that much better than the probability of heads or tails landing on a coin flip. If you consistently put your money in positions where in this even money odds range your guy is more likely to win, over the long term, you can really start to grind out some nice steady profits. I actually measure my performance on basically bets in the even money odds range on my website, and as you can see, over the last 2 years since I've been tracking my performance on bets in this even money odds range, we've performed really, really well. There's a nice steady uptrend here. So I absolutely love to research fights in this odds range, bet fights in this odds range, and I do, as you can see from this profitability chart, I do tend to perform quite well on bets in this even money odds range. Odds of between 1.65 and 2.30. But 1.91 is right smack in the middle, which is about minus 110. And so this is a very interesting fight for us to dive into. So before we talk about how these guys match up from a stylistic point of view, it's very important to understand our goal, what we're trying to do when we research fights in this odds range. Because every single bet carries risk, right? If you ever find a bet that doesn't have any risk attached to it at all, chances are you haven't researched it well enough, and there are going to be certain factors that you're missing, certain risk factors that you're missing. Sometimes people will come to me and they'll say, Pete Yan's got absolutely no chance of losing this weekend. He's going to kill Aljamain Sterling. It's an easy fight for him. And I'm like, okay, he should win. I agree with you. But you're probably overlooking some significant risk factors there in that matchup, which you really should take into consideration if you're going to be betting someone like Pete Yan as a big favourite. So in the case of Alexei Oleinik and Jared Vanderaa, they are two guys that have big weaknesses, right? If you listen to anyone this week that tells you Alexei Oleinik's going to win easily or Jared Vanderaa is going to win easily, run a mile from them, because that's not the case. I'm not saying one of these guys can't go out there and smoke the other dude in 2 minutes, but there are huge issues and huge risk factors with betting on both guys. So no matter which side you go with here, whether you pick Oleinik or you pick Vanderaa, there's going to be a lot of risk there. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can't find a good bet, because ultimately we're just trying to assess whether we're getting a good risk to reward ratio for our money based on the odds. When we look at the odds compared to all the risk factors and all the paths to victory that are present with both guys. And so just because there's a lot of risk on a fighter doesn't necessarily mean that you can't bet them and still get good value. So remember that, because I do think that there's a good bet on this fight, but it does come with quite a lot of risk. Having said that, I still feel betting that particular fighter carries a good risk to reward ratio. And over the long term, putting your money in spots like this will yield a profit. And like I say, the performance on bets in this odds range over the last 2 years prove that. I performed pretty well. So, start off by taking a look at the X factors. There are some notable X factors to talk about in this one. I guess the first that we should kind of address is the fact that Jared Vanderaa is stepping up to take this fight on short notice. Alexei Oleinik was originally supposed to be facing Ilir Latifi, and Latifi withdrew last week. So I think Vanderaa is coming into this fight on around about 10 days notice, just over a week, which isn't ideal. But I don't think the fact that Vanderaa is coming into this fight on short notice will have too much of an impact on this matchup for a few reasons. The first reason being, if you check out Vandeera's Instagram, if you kind of check in with this guy on a regular basis to see what he's up to, he seems to always be in the gym. Seems to be one of these guys who's always in the gym training. And so whenever I see a guy always in the gym training, even when they don't have a fight scheduled, when they get called up on short notice, it's not as big of a risk factor to me, because they're kind of always in the gym working anyway. And that definitely seems to be the case with Vanderaa. Another reason why I don't think it's that big of a deal that Vanderaa is stepping up to take this fight on short notice is because one of his biggest strengths is his cardio. Vanderaa is one of these heavyweights that can fight at a really good pace for 3 rounds. And so he's already coming from a pretty good place where his gas tank is decent. So even if he's not coming into this fight in tip-top fight shape, his cardio is already in a pretty good place, to the extent that if he's regularly in the gym, he should still be able to perform at a decent level, because, you know, Vanderaa is a heavyweight. He probably walks around at roughly the weight that he weighs in on, so it's not like, you know, his training camp is going to consist of strict dieting and having to manage a really difficult weight cut. You know, he's probably in the gym regularly, and he can just show up and fight on Saturday night without, you know, having to put, you know, too much effort into his weight cut and managing his diet and all that kind of stuff. So Vandeera's got a pretty good pretty good gas tank, pretty good cardio for a heavyweight, and on top of that, we know that Alexei Oleinik doesn't, right? Which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. We're going to talk about Oleinik's age in a minute, but, you know, Oleinik is 45 years old, and at 45 years old, he just can't fight at a high pace anymore. So Oleinik is one of these guys that can be pretty dangerous and pretty aggressive in round one, but the longer the fight goes into that second and third round, he gets very tired and very sloppy. So if Jared Vanderaa was fighting another guy with an amazing gas tank, or someone that was going to be able to push a crazy pace here and make Vanderaa work very hard, I'd be a little bit more concerned about the fact that he's taking the fight on short notice. But because he's facing someone like Oleinik, the gas is really bad. If Vanderaa were coming into this fight not in the best shape because he's coming on short notice, it probably won't be that much of an issue, because even on short notice, his gas tank is probably a lot better than Oleinik's is going to be. So the short notice thing is not really too much of an issue here for me. If we go back to his age, which is going to be the second X factor that I'm going to focus on, we can see that Oleinik is very old and he has a lot of miles on the clock. He is going to be 45 years old next month on the 25th of June, and he's had over 70 pro fights. So not only is Oleinik one of the oldest guys in the UFC, he might actually be the oldest guy in the UFC, but he's also got an enormous amount of miles on the clock because of the number of fights that he's had. He's been consistently competing against some of the toughest fighters in the world for a huge chunk of his career, and I can't think of anyone else in the UFC that's got as many fights as this guy. Think of all the wear and tear on his body, all the damage he sustained, all the chronic long-term injuries that have built up. When athletic commissions allow Oleinik to strap his knees up, not all athletic commissions do, but the ones that do, you know, you can see him with heavily strapped up knees, and, you know, I would imagine this guy's body is pretty beat up. Probably can't take a shot like he used to. We've already talked about his cardio not being the best at this stage in his career. So that's a lot of miles on the clock, and he's pretty old. Father Time is undefeated. We know that, you know, heavyweight fighters tend to peak later on in their career, and there are, you know, guys in the heavyweight division who have performed well into their 40s, right? Randy Couture, Daniel Cormier, probably the two best examples. And you've got guys like Andrei Arlovski. It can be done. But Oleinik is showing signs of major decline. And Oleinik is approaching, well, he is in his mid-40s now, right? Arlovski, early 40s. Randy Couture and DC had retired by the time they reached Oleinik's age. So this is a young man's game, a young man's sport. And while the heavyweight division is a little bit more forgiving to the older guys, it is only a matter of time before Oleinik's got to retire and hang it up. And he is slow, he is easy to hit, he does have a bad gas tank, and he is showing all the signs of a fighter on a very steep decline. He makes up for a lot of that just by being tough and determined and having that, you know, real strong mentality in the heart of a lion. But that can only take you so much before, you know, you kind of need the skills and the athleticism to back it up. And at this stage in Oleinik's career, they're starting to wane a little bit. We'll sort this camera out. It's dropping down. Sorry about that. There we go. That is a little bit better. Okay, so the age is a big issue with Oleinik. And just to kind of round out that point, the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time. That's 70. 70% of the time when there is a 10-year age gap in a fight. In this fight, there is so Vanderaa is 10, 11. So Vandeera's, well, if we say that Oleinik's virtually, 45 years old, because he's going to be 45 next month, that means that there is a 16-year age gap in this fight. So if the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there is a 10-year age gap in a fight, imagine what the statistic is when there's a 16-year age gap in a fight. So if you're just purely betting off that statistic alone, you're probably getting good value on Jared Vanderaa. Because if we think about this logically now, if you didn't know anything about how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view, but you know that Vanderaa is 16 years younger than Oleinik, and younger fighters win 70% of the time when there is a 10-year age gap in a fight. If we just take that statistic, Vandeera's odds at 1.91 carry an implied probability of 52%. So if we know fighters, the younger fighter, when there's an age gap like this, has at least a 70% chance of winning, you're getting an 18% margin over the betting sites purely based on that statistic alone. Now, obviously, we're not going to be blind betting guys just based on their age. That would be very foolish. But that does highlight how much potential value there may be on Vanderaa here before we even get into considering how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view. If we look at the size of these two, Oleinik is 6'2" with an 80-inch reach compared to Jared Vanderaa, who's 6'4" with an 80-inch reach. So both guys roughly about the same size, but age and the decline of Oleinik is definitely something to consider in this one. So now let's talk about how they match up from a stylistic point of view. And I guess we should start off with striking, because it's probably the easiest thing to cover. So when we look at how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view, I do think that Oleinik could cause Vanderaa some trouble on the feet early on. Oleinik is just, a tough, gritty, determined blue-collar striker that has pretty sloppy technique. He's not particularly dangerous standing, but he is very aggressive, and he looks to just come forward in straight lines, kind of closing his eyes, windmilling forward, throwing these big, heavy hooks to get inside, grab a hold of you, so he can then start working for a takedown from the clinch. But Oleinik is tough as nails. He's very aggressive, and he's one of these guys that will not quit. He's got the dog in him, and so every single second he's in there, he's going to be trying to win. He's going to be trying to drag you to the ground or punch you in the face. So early on, when Oleinik is fresh, at the end of the day, he's a big, strong, tough Russian. And if he hits you hard, he's going to hurt you. So early on in the fight, on the feet, Oleinik can be dangerous. Even though his technique is very sloppy, he bites down on his mouthpiece, comes forward and fully commits to everything he throws. And that makes him quite dangerous. However, because of his gas tank issues, which we've already discussed in this video, Oleinik is a guy that does slow down a lot after round one. And so while Oleinik may be able to cause Vanderaa some problems on the feet in round one because he is heavy-handed despite the lack of technique, going into rounds 2 and 3, his hand speed really becomes very slow. His striking becomes much more sloppier than it was in round 1, which is pretty incredible considering how sloppy he is when he's fresh. And on top of that, his volume also drops. So Oleinik can cause Vanderaa some problems on the feet in round 1, but I think if Vanderaa can survive round 1, take this fight into rounds 2 and 3, I think he's going to cause Oleinik big trouble on the feet. There are a lot of things that Jared Vanderaa does well when it comes to striking. The first thing that I really like about Vanderaa is the fact that he's a tough fucker. He's got a good chin, he can take a shot, and that's obviously going to help him in this matchup because, well, Oleinik doesn't have that one shot, KO power. It doesn't have that kind of, big bomb in his hand to knock you out with one shot. Oleinik does break guys down with pressure and volume and overwhelm them. But Vandeera's tough. He's got a good chin. I don't think Vanderaa is going to break under any pressure that Oleinik could put on him on the feet. I'm not saying that Oleinik can't break Vanderaa if the fight were to go to the ground, but on the feet, whatever Oleinik throws at Vanderaa, I think Vanderaa is going to be able to take it just fine. Vanderaa is not very good defensively, but he can take a shot, and Oleinik isn't the most dangerous on the feet. So, like I say, Vandeera's got a good chin. He should be tough enough, durable enough to weather the early storm, take this fight into rounds 2 and 3, where he can cause Oleinik big trouble. Another thing that I really like about Jared Vanderaa is that he fights at a very high pace. Earlier on in the video, we were talking about how for a heavyweight, he's got really, really good cardio. And that enables him to throw a very high volume of strikes throughout the entire duration of the matchup. Remember what we said with Oleinik? Oleinik gasses bad after round 1, and when he does gas, the volume of strikes he throws, falls off a cliff. He just doesn't really throw that much. That gives Vanderaa a big opportunity to outstrike and outwork Oleinik in rounds 2 and 3 by a wide margin. On top of that, he can also inflict big damage on Oleinik. Vanderaa doesn't have that kind of one-shot KO power either. He's more of a volume striker that breaks you down and wears you down. But Oleinik, when he gets tired, becomes even worse defensively and too tired to defend himself, which gives Vanderaa big opportunities on the feet to inflict a lot of damage. Another weapon that Vandeera's got that he can use to cause Oleinik big trouble in this matchup are his kicks. If you go back and watch his fight against Justin Tafa, he really shows some pretty nasty kicks. Brilliant leg kicks, brilliant body kicks. A lot of snap on him. They land with big power, big impact, and he does a lot of damage with them. His body kicks are huge in a fight like this, because if he starts hammering that body of Oleinik, it's going to accelerate the rate at which Oleinik gasses out, because obviously big shots to the body take the wind out of your sails. And Vandeera's leg kicks are also pretty nasty as well. Now, Oleinik has got pretty bad footwork, pretty bad movement. He's quite flat-footed. He's even worse in terms of his movement when he starts to get tired. And Vanderaa can hammer those legs that are already pretty beat up and injured to further affect the mobility of Alexei Oleinik. Now, you're probably at this stage thinking, well, this guy that Chris is talking about, Jared Vanderaa, sounds pretty good, but I remember watching him against Andrei Arlovski. He didn't really demonstrate any of these skills that Chris is talking about. Has Chris got this one wrong? And the answer to that question is no, but it is a valid question. The question is, why didn't Vanderaa cause a guy like Andrei Arlovski big trouble with his leg kicks, his body kicks, his volume striking, right? You're probably thinking, Chris is very complimentary of Vandeera's striking, but we didn't see any of this against Arlovski, so what is he on about? The reason why Vanderaa struggled to have success with these techniques against Andrei Arlovski is because Vanderaa is simply not good at cutting the cage off and landing on a moving target. Andrei Arlovski at this stage in his career is basically a counter striker that is very light on his feet, very elusive, and he likes to stay on the outside, circle away from his opponents and pick them off as they come forward. So Arlovski is a completely different stylistic opponent to Oleinik. When Vanderaa would come forward and attack Arlovski, Arlovski wasn't there for him. He was just looking to circle away and chip away at Vanderaa, and Vanderaa just didn't have the footwork and movement to use that lateral movement, that side-to-side movement, to cut the octagon off and actually get his strikes off and land on Arlovski. Vanderaa just didn't have the skills to do that. But he's not going to need to worry about that against Oleinik, because Oleinik is not a counter-striker. He doesn't have the footwork and movement of Arlovski. Oleinik stands right in front of you in kickboxing range, where he's going to be a sitting duck to the big kicking game of Vanderaa, in the same way that we saw Justin Tafa was, because again, Justin Tafa stands right in front of you as well. He's not a counter-striker either. So I understand that Vanderaa didn't look particularly dangerous, didn't look particularly good against Arlovski, but styles make fights, and stylistically, Arlovski was a much different style and problem for Vanderaa to solve than Oleinik is. So on the feet, as long as Vanderaa can avoid eating anything crazy in round 1, I think he's going to do pretty well in this fight. I wouldn't even rule him out knocking Oleinik out. 45 years old, Oleinik's not going to be able to take a shot like he used to. But at the very beginning of this breakdown, we were talking about how every single fight or every single fighter has weaknesses that can be exploited, and how every single bet that you will think of placing will have risk factors. And the fact is, if there were no major risk factors present with either of these guys in this matchup, the odds wouldn't be in the even money odds range, right? If one of these guys had massive advantages over the other everywhere, we would be looking at odds similar to what we've got in the Petr Yan Sterling fight or the Volkanovski Korean Zombie fight. It's not the case here. we know that there are issues with Vanderaa. We know that there are big holes in his game that Alexei Oleinik could potentially exploit. And what's very dangerous about this fight for Vanderaa is that his biggest weakness is obviously his grappling, which just so happens to be Alexei Oleinik's strength. But I don't think it's a deal breaker. And in that even money odds range, I do believe Vanderaa is a good bet this weekend. It's not a bet that I'm super confident in, but it is a bet which I feel gives you a good risk to reward ratio for all the reasons that I've mentioned so far, but also for how these guys match up when it comes to grappling. So, when Jared Vanderaa first came into the UFC, he was taken down and dominated on the ground very easily by Sergey Spivak. That fight wasn't very long ago, it was about a year ago. It was a very, very poor performance from Jared Vanderaa, and his ground game looked completely non-existent, which is very strange to me because Jared Vanderaa, as you can see from the Team Quest badge here, and if you go to his Instagram profile, he's tagged Dan Henderson in his bio. There he is, Team Quest, Dan Henderson's Team Quest gym. There he is. There's Dan Henderson. When I saw how bad Jared Vanderaa looked on the ground against Sergey Spivak, it was very strange to me because Jared Vanderaa comes from Team Quest, which is really strong MMA grappling lineage. You think of all the great MMA grapplers that have come from, Team Quest. Think about the Chael Sonnens, the Randy Coutures, the Matt Lindlands, the Dan Hendersons. Even guys like Chris Lieben, Ed Herman. Didn't reach the heights of some of those other names, but these were guys that were very difficult to take down, very difficult to hold down. Whenever you see a Team Quest fighter come into the UFC, even now, you can pretty much bank on them being difficult to take down and hold down. Sam Alvey is probably the best example I can think of, right? Sam Alvey is memed to death. He's seen as basically a joke in MMA. But when have you ever seen someone take Sam Alvey down and dominate him on the ground? Despite all of Sam Alvey's weaknesses, the one thing that you cannot criticise him for is his takedown offence and ability to work back up to his feet when he does get taken down. That's because he's a product of Team Quest. These Team Quest guys are notoriously difficult to take down and hold down. So when I saw how much success Sergey Spivak had against Vanderaa, it was very puzzling to me because it directly contradicted what I would expect to see from a Team Quest fighter. And that's obviously where Jared Vanderaa has been training throughout the majority of his career. But I was very pleased by what I saw from him in his fight against Alexander Romanov. Even though these fights were only a few months apart, February to October, the improvements to Jared Vandeera's defensive wrestling between Spivak and Romanov were absolutely huge. Now, I know he lost both fights, but ultimately the devil is in the detail, and when you look at the techniques demonstrated by Vanderaa in each of those matchups, you can see that he is making massive improvements from fight to fight when it comes to grappling. And so I know he got taken down, dominated on the ground by Romanov, but Romanov is a really good offensive wrestler. He's very athletic, he's very powerful, and when he shoots in to try and take his opponents down, he gets in really nice and deep on his opponent's legs and hips. Romanov also has a heavy top game, good grappling control, really good chain wrestling. Romanov is one of the best grapplers I've ever seen in the heavyweight division. He's really, really good. His cardio is going to let him down. We saw in the Juan Espino fight he slowed down a lot. But early on, Alexander Romanov is a nightmare. So what I saw from Vanderaa in that Romanov fight were a lot of skills which I believe give him a pretty good chance of weathering the early storm against Alexei Oleinik. Because I feel with how much Oleinik slows down, if Vanderaa can just make it through round one, I think his chances of winning this fight are very, very high. Oleinik's going to be dangerous in round one because how aggressive he is on the feet and how dangerous he is on the ground. But if Vanderaa can just tough out round one and weather that early storm, I think he's going to do very well here. So when we're talking about betting Vanderaa, the real one big question we need to ask ourselves is what are the chances that Oleinik gets Vanderaa to the ground and submits him early on? Well, this can definitely happen. We've already spoken about how Vandeera's biggest weaknesses are on the ground. But the devil is in the detail, and the way that these two guys match up when it comes to grappling do suggest that Vanderaa can make life difficult for Oleinik and, like I say, survive that first round. So what are some of these specific things that I'm talking about? Well, if you look at the techniques that Romanov used to get Vanderaa to the ground, he was shooting in deep on the legs and hips of Vanderaa with traditional single leg, double leg wrestling takedowns, upsetting Vandeera's balance and basically dragging him to the ground. That's not the kind of offensive wrestling we see from Oleinik. At 45 years old at this stage in his career, he's very stiff, he's very rigid, he's not athletic anymore, and he's quite slow. So he's not able to shoot those traditional single leg and double leg takedowns that you see from a guy like Romanov. Oleinik has got to come forward, punch his way inside, grab a hold of his opponent, and then look to drag him to the ground from the clinch. He can't really bend down and get in on the legs and hips of his opponents because he's just not that mobile anymore. His knees are all beat up. And as a result of that, his offensive wrestling is a lot easier to stuff and shut down than someone like Romanov's. Oleinik is much more of an opportunistic grappler, where he doesn't really have the offensive wrestling to take guys down anymore. So he'll look for trips and throws and ways to kind of bait his opponents into the ground. Like we've even seen this guy pull guard, in some of his recent fights. So I'm not saying that Oleinik can't take Vanderaa down like he might. Anything can happen. It's not like Vandeera's takedown defense is bulletproof. But what I am saying is it isn't going to be easy for Oleinik to get this fight to the ground. And if he does, he might not be able to hold Vanderaa down. Because what we saw in the Romanov fight was Vanderaa do a really good job of getting those underhooks in play early to make it very difficult for Romanov to complete the takedowns. And when the fight did go to the ground, Vanderaa did a really good job of safely working his way back up to his feet. Now in round 2, after Vanderaa had been, forced to carry, Romanov's body weight for a good 6 or 7 minutes, he was worn down, too tired to defend himself, and eventually Romanov was able to get a stoppage on the ground when Vanderaa was too tired to defend himself. But I don't think Oleinik is going to be able to put that kind of pace on Vanderaa and break him like Romanov did. I really feel like if Vanderaa can just make it out of round 1 and survive round 1, Oleinik will be too tired to take him down into the second and third round. It'll be much easier in rounds 2 and 3 for Vanderaa to use that Team Quest defensive wrestling to keep the fight standing, and from there Vanderaa should cruise on the feet. So when we summarise everything that I've said in terms of how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view, and we bring everything back to the original point that I made at the beginning of this breakdown, I feel Vanderaa is a pretty good bet here. As ever, do your own research and do your own research and just use what I say as a resource. Don't go rushing out and betting someone because I'm telling you to bet them. What I'm saying is I'm betting Vanderaa because when I look at all the information available on this fight, I think it's more than reasonable to give Vanderaa a 60% chance of winning this matchup. And with his odds currently carrying an implied probability of 52%, that gives us a really good 8% margin over the bookies. That doesn't mean I'm super confident Vanderaa wins, because ultimately his biggest weakness is on the ground, and he's the exact kind of guy that can fall into a mad submission on the ground. We know Oleinik is tough, game, scrappy, and has no quit in him. But when you take into consideration the fact that Vandeera's got a better gas tank, a better chin, he's younger, he fights at a higher pace, he's got a big advantage on the feet, he's not easy to take down anymore and not easy to hold down, and we know Oleinik is going to be declining from fight to fight. When we take into consideration all those things, there are a lot of reasons to like Vanderaa in this fight. The only risk factor that I can think of, Oleinik catching him with something crazy on the feet and knocking him out, but we've already said that's not a huge risk factor because Oleinik doesn't have that one-shot KO power, and Vanderaa is pretty durable, pretty tough. He's got a good chin, so that's always going to be a factor with heavyweights, but it's not a massive one in this one. And then the big factor to consider is obviously Oleinik strong on the ground and Vanderaa isn't, but we've already covered why that isn't a complete deal breaker and how Vanderaa is likely to do just fine if he can weather the early storm and make it out of round 1. So I would say do your own research on this, consider the information that I've shared with you in this breakdown. I will be betting Vanderaa this weekend. I'm not super confident he wins, but I do think I'm getting a good deal, a good risk to reward ratio, and I think is more than reasonable to cap Vanderaa at 60%, which means you're getting a really good risk to reward ratio with his odds currently being in that even money odds range, which makes absolutely no sense to me. If I were capping this fight, I would have had Vanderaa at like 1.50 minus 200, 1.60, which would be minus 167. I would have him in that odds range, because obviously odds of 1.60 minus 167 have that 63% implied probability. 1.50 minus 200, 67% implied probability. That's what I would cap Vanderaa at. So lots of value in his odds in that even money odds range. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. We will now talk about another very interesting, very complex matchup. This time we're going to be breaking down the fight between Mackenzie Dern and Tecia Torres. If you like these breakdown videos, don't forget to hit the like button. You know, the more engagement I get on these videos, the more motivated I am to keep pumping out as much content as possible. And if you want to watch breakdown videos like this for all the prelim fights on this card, don't forget to check out my website, MMABettingTips.com. We now check out the fight between Mackenzie Dern and Tecia Torres. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that both these girls are, again, in that even money odds range. So Tecia Torres, the slight underdog, but the odds seem to be coming closer together. So we will just say the odds on both girls, again, are roughly in that 1.91, minus 110, 52% implied probability range. And again, I absolutely love the research fights in this odds range, because again, if you can just lean 60-40 one way or the other, you can find a really strong position to put your money. So what I am going to do is bring up the UFC stats website, because we will need this in a little while. Where are we going? Where is she? Tecia. There she is. Okay, so if we look at the tail of the tape, so Mackenzie Dern is 29 years old, 5'4", with a 63-inch reach, and Tecia Torres is 32 years old, 5'1", with a 61-inch reach. So both these girls roughly about the same size and roughly about the same age. No notable X factors to mention there. Mackenzie Dern will be a bit bigger, but nothing major, and I don't think it's going to have any impact on this fight at all, because Dern's not the most physically imposing fighter, and Tecia Torres is one of the smallest strawweights in the UFC. Pretty much everyone that she's ever fought has had a size advantage over her, so I think she's actually going to enjoy the fact that Dern isn't that much bigger than her, because usually she's given up a much bigger size and reach advantage than this, with Tecia being on the smaller side for a strawweight. So let's get into how these two girls match up from a stylistic point of view. It's a very complex fight, this. Obviously, Mackenzie Dern has a base in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Tecia Torres has a base in Taekwondo. Classic striker versus grappler matchup. And so when we're researching fights like this, trying to predict who has the best chance of winning, the question we're usually trying to answer is what is the chances of Mackenzie Dern getting this fight to the ground and keeping this fight on the ground for long enough to cause Tecia Torres big enough problems to win this fight. That's mainly what we're going to be focusing on in this one. But we'll start off by talking about the striking, because that's a little bit easier to break down than the grappling, which is more complex. We'll get into that in a minute. But in terms of striking, what's interesting about this fight is that both girls do share some similarities when it comes to striking, because they both like to fight in the same range. They fight in the same range for very different reasons, though. And the range they like to fight is all the way out to a range where they can be hit. So Tecia Torres fights all the way out to a range where she can be hit, because she's very small for the division, and she's used to giving up big reach advantages to most of her opponents. As a result of this, she fights all the way outside of her opponent's range, so they have to cover a lot of distance to get inside and land on her. Tecia Torres has got good footwork, good movement. She's very good at reading her opponents, which enables her to kind of stay light on her feet, circle away from her opponents, and keep that safe distance where they really need to commit, come forward and cover a lot of distance in order to land on her. So that is how Tecia Torres' defense looks. She doesn't stand right in front of her opponents where she can be hit. She's all the way out of that kickboxing range, all the way out of that boxing range where she's not there to be hit. Tecia Torres' offense comes from blitzing attacks. So she rushes forward in straight lines, chin up high and exposed, and just look to, uncork a 3-4-5 strike combo before getting back outside the range. And she looks to use her, high-level taekwondo technique, her speed and her accuracy to get in and get out without being hit. And that is pretty much Tecia Torres' style of striking in a nutshell. Mackenzie Dern also fights in the same range as Tecia Torres, but for different reasons. She fights all the way outside the range where she can be hit because she's not a comfortable striker. She's not a natural striker. She is making big improvements to her striking. Sorry, I've got an itchy nose. She is making big improvements to her striking, but it's still not quite there. So she still struggles to read her opponents. To negate that, she stands all the way outside of a range where she can be hit, so that when her opponents do come forward and attack her, she sees them coming, because they're coming from a farther distance away, which then enables her to cover up or get out the way and increases her chances of taking less damage, because her opponents have got to cover a lot more distance to get to her than if she were to stand right in front of them in that boxing or kickboxing range. So Mackenzie Dern and Tecia Torres like to fight very far away from their opponents, which could lead to a bit of an ugly, awkward stand-up matchup where neither girl really wants to engage too much, and it tends to be a little bit awkward with neither girl having a ton of success. On the feet, I obviously give the advantage to Tecia Torres. She's a lot more technical than Dern. She throws a higher volume of strikes. She's more accurate. But I do also think Dern can make this close if it stays on the feet because of her awkwardness. The range she fights in is very awkward, and Tecia's going to be reluctant to engage with Dern for fear of giving Dern opportunities to tie her up and take her down. Now, that segues nicely into how these girls match up when it comes to grappling, because Mackenzie Dern's style of striking is great in the sense that it prevents her from taking a lot of damage when she doesn't have the skills to read her opponents and defend herself adequately. But the huge drawback of fighting in the range that Dern fights in is that when she comes forward to try and tie up with her opponents to drag them to the ground, she has to cover a lot of distance. So remember we were saying that Dern stays all the way outside of a range where she can be hit so that she can see her opponents come in and then react to them. That also swings the other way. When Dern is coming forward to look to tie them up and drag them to the ground, they can also see her coming, which is one of the reasons why Dern has so much trouble getting fights to the ground. If you go back and watch a lot of Mackenzie Dern's fights, it will kind of go one way or the other. There will be some of her fights where she will drag her opponents to the ground straight away and cause them huge problems on the ground and submit them very quickly. Or you get the fights like the Marina Rodriguez fight or the Virna Jandiroba fight where Dern really struggles to get the fight to the ground and doesn't have a lot of success with her takedowns at all. Someone like Tecia Torres could prove to be very difficult for Dern to take down because Torres is a pretty high level striker. She's been training Taekwondo since she was a little girl, and so she's very good at reading her opponents, and she's going to see Mackenzie Dern's takedown entries coming from a mile away. When Dern starts to come forward and look to tie Torres up, that's when Torres can back up, get on her bike and circle away. So it could be very difficult for Dern to grab a hold of Torres in this matchup. I'm really disappointed by the rate of improvement that we've seen from Dern. I was expecting a lot more from her because she's an extremely high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner. And I think whenever you've got a fighter who has reached that elite level in any particular martial art, that shows that they've got the ability to learn from mistakes, grow, improve, and pretty much be good at anything, right? Because, there's no difference in becoming elite at any skill, right? It just takes a lot of practice, a lot of hard work, and a lot of learning from mistakes. So if someone can put a lot of work into becoming an elite Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, they're probably, they've probably got a pretty good chance of applying, that same work ethic and ability to learn to other martial arts. And so, whenever I see someone like Mackenzie Dern come along that's very high level in one discipline, I always get excited because I would expect them to improve at quite a rapid rate in all other areas as well. Haven't really seen that with Mackenzie Dern though. I feel that she's making baby steps forward as opposed to the exponential improvements and exponential growth that I was hoping to see. If you look at Mackenzie Dern, she's 29 years old now and she's been in the UFC for a while. She made her debut all the way back in 2018, March 2018, which is pretty much 4 years ago to the day. And while Mackenzie Dern has definitely improved in that time, she's not a massively different fighter now to what we saw from her in 2018. The same issues, the same weaknesses that were holding her back in 2018 still hold her back to this day, which is really disappointing. What we've always said about Mackenzie Dern is that she lacks the offensive wrestling to get fights to the ground. If she gets you to the ground, she's an absolute nightmare. She's got a heavy top game, crushing grappling control, and one of the most dangerous submission games in the entire, UFC. She is a nightmare if she gets you to the ground. But her problem is that she really struggles to take her opponents down. She just hasn't really developed any offensive wrestling. You very rarely see Dern shoot a single leg or a double leg or look for a body lock, inside, outside trip takedown. And when she does go for those techniques, she just doesn't really have the fluidity to her style or the physicality to just drag people to the ground. Dern is much more of an opportunistic grappler or opportunistic wrestler that looks for funky trips and throws which don't work against everyone, and we've seen that in some of her recent fights, and we've seen that if you do shut her offensive wrestling down, which is very limited, she becomes quite easy to deal with. And so Mackenzie Dern's in this awkward position where she has an ultra high level, dangerous weapon that she can use in her Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but she quite often struggles to get fights to the ground where she can actually use it. Now, when it comes to Tecia Torres, the big question we're obviously trying to answer here is what is the probability that Dern can get Torres to the ground? That is a difficult question to answer. What I would say about Tecia Torres is that she does have pretty good takedown defense. Her lower center of gravity will also make it harder for Dern to take her down. If you think of Tecia Torres, she's quite short, quite muscular, quite compact. It's not going to be easy to get in deep on the legs and hips of Torres and upset her balance. But what I would say about Torres is that her takedown defense isn't bulletproof. She does have a habit of giving up cheap takedowns at times through complacency or a lack of concentration. And you really do not want to go to the ground with someone like Mackenzie Dern, because it can be a death sentence, right? All she needs is one takedown to submit you. And if she does get Torres to the ground, Torres is going to be in a lot of trouble in this fight. Now, I've brought up Tecia Torres' stats here because a lot of the time stats in MMA are not that useful, because if you understand how to analyze data, you'll know that statistics are only useful when they come, or when the statistic is accrued from a large data set, right? You have a really large sample size to make that statistic really useful and really worthwhile. And we rarely get that in MMA because fighters only fight maybe once, twice, 3 times per year. They only spend 15 minutes in those fights, and sometimes they end within minutes or seconds, right, if there's a submission or a knockout. And so you don't get enough repetitions from the fighters in the octagon to actually generate good quality data. It's not like a football team that once or twice a week, every single week throughout a 9-month season, they will spend 90 minutes on the pitch doing lots of repetitions, completing hundreds of passes, tens of shots on goal, and you can see how much yardage the players are running, and all the ground they're covering, all that kind of thing. What positions they're conceding goals from, scoring goals from. Football teams spend so much time on the pitch, doing repetitions, which enable you to generate really good quality data. The statistics in a sport like football are extremely useful, but we just do not have that in MMA, or we rarely get it. But with the case of Tecia Torres, this is one of those rare situations where we actually have a really good quality piece of data that we can use to, assess what Mackenzie Dern's chances of getting this fight to the ground are. And that is her takedown defense stat. Tecia Torres' takedown defense stat is really useful here because Tecia Torres is someone that has had a lot of fights in the UFC, right? She came into the UFC all the way back in 2014. And on top of that, most of her fights have gone to a decision. Look at how many decisions that she's fought to, right? She's an absolute decision machine. So not only has Tecia Torres had a lot of fights in the UFC against a very diverse, range of opponents with various different styles, but she's also spent a lot of time in the octagon. This isn't someone that's had 14 pro fights and, half of them have finished in the first round by knockout. She has spent a lot of time in the octagon, and so we've got a lot of repetitions and a lot of data, which makes this takedown defense stat extremely useful. 58% is not great, right? If you shoot two takedowns on this girl, got a pretty good chance of landing one of them. If you shoot 3 takedowns on her, really, really good chance of landing 1 out of 3. And we know that Mackenzie Dern only needs to land 1 takedown in this fight to tie Tecia Torres up in knots, cause her big problems, and potentially submit her. If Dern gets this fight to the ground and has 2-3 minutes to work, Torres is going to be in a world of trouble. Torres is pretty well rounded. She's a pretty good grappler. She trained at American Top Team for a big chunk of her career. But there is still a huge skill gap here on the ground. And she needs to treat the ground like lava. So to summarize everything I've just said and make sense of everything I've just said from a betting point of view, you've got to lean Mackenzie Dern in this fight. My logic being, while Tecia Torres does have an advantage on the feet, it's not a massive advantage. And the fact that they're both quite awkward on the feet, or Mackenzie Dern in particular is awkward, and they both fight, really far outside of their opponent's range. Torres will likely edge Dern on the feet, but I don't think she's going to light Dern up on the feet, blow her out the water and dominate if it stays standing. I think Torres will just edge her. Whereas if the fight goes to the ground, it's going to be utter domination for Dern. There's nothing Torres can do to be competitive. That's why I lean towards Mackenzie Dern here. And when you look at Tecia Torres' takedown defense statistic, we know that it's not going to be easy for Mackenzie Dern to get this fight to the ground, because Mackenzie Dern's offensive wrestling isn't very good, and Tecia Torres isn't easy to take down. But if Dern does persist with the takedown, we know that there's a likelihood that at some point in this fight, she's probably going to get the takedown, and when that happens, Torres is going to be in a lot of trouble. So this is not a fight that I'm going to be betting this weekend, because I'm not impressed by Dern's offensive wrestling. I'm not convinced she can get the fight to the ground. But all things considered, when you look at the big picture and take all information into consideration here, I do think Dern is the better side to be on, the stronger side to be on, probably has the better chance of winning. So if you really do want to bet this fight this weekend, I would recommend you bet Mackenzie Dern, but there's a lot of risk with betting her, and you're not getting a particularly good risk to reward ratio on her. Not like, with a guy like Jared Vanderaa. If we look at Vanderaa, look at all the advantages he's got in that fight compared to Dern. Just goes to show really how strong of a position Vanderaa is, because you can bet, Dern or Torres at the same odds as Vanderaa, and neither girl has anywhere near as many advantages in this fight as Vanderaa has over Oleinik. So that kind of highlights how the odds are quite off in the Vanderaa fight, because you can see why Torres and Dern are in that even money odds range. It's a very, very competitive matchup. But the Vanderaa-Oleinik fight, you know what I'm trying to say. I've already said it. I need a goddamn drink. Alright. We're an hour in and we've only covered 2 fights. Very complex matchups though. This is why I just have the breakdown videos on the website, man. It's I go into a lot of depth on these fights, and if I broke down every fight on YouTube, I mean, these videos would be like 4 or 5 hours long. It's it's the levels you have to go to be profitable betting on a sport like MMA. But we go into a lot of depth, man. We go into a hell of a lot of depth, and we're going to go into a lot of depth on this next one between Gilbert Burns and Khamzat Chimaev. So we've just talked about 2 really interesting fights from a betting point of view, with Oleinik and Vanderaa and Dern and Torres being in that even money odds range. And now the next 3 fights we're going to talk about are very interesting from a fan point of view, because we're going to be talking about some really popular, very talented, very skilled fighters, but they're not as interesting from a betting point of view because, you know, the next 3 fights we're going to be talking about do focus on heavy favourites versus heavy underdogs, and I'm not in love with the underdogs in these matchups, if I'm honest with you. So spoiler alert, the rest of this video is going to have a lot of love for some big chalky favourites, which I'm personally not a big favourite of betting, and I'm sure you're not either, but let's get into it anyway. So let's talk about the fight between Burns and Chimaev. So if we check out the odds on this one, we can see that oh yeah, his odds don't appear for some reason on UFC and the UFC 273 on Best Fight Odds. You have to Control F it. Anyway, here he is. So Gilbert Burns against Chimaev. So Chimaev, one of the biggest favourites on the card, at average odds of about 1.19, which is going to be minus 526 for an implied probability of 84%. If you take a look at the odds on Gilbert Burns, he is around an average of, call it 5.0, which is going to be plus 400 for an implied probability of 20%. So Gilbert Burns, obviously a massive step up in competition for Khamzat Chimaev this weekend. Chimaev has never fought anyone anywhere near the level of Gilbert Burns before, and yet despite this, Chimaev is an absolutely massive favourite, which is pretty interesting. So in terms of the tail of the tape, Gilbert Burns is 35 years old. He's going to be 36 years old in a couple of months, which is very, very old for a welterweight. He's also 5'10" with a 71-inch reach. Chimaev, 27 years old. He will be 28 years old next month. He's 6'2" with a 75-inch reach. So there's a couple of X factors for us to focus on there. As you can see, Chimaev is 8 years younger than Gilbert Burns. Now, we know that the younger fighter wins around 67% of the time when there's an 8-year age gap in a fight, so already that favours Chimaev. But on top of that, we could also see he's got a decent size advantage here. He's 6'2" compared to Gilbert Burns, who's 5'10". He's also got a 4-inch reach advantage. Now, this is a pretty big factor to take into consideration because with a wingspan like this, Chimaev could fight up as high as light heavyweight. He's absolutely massive for a welterweight, and he's one of the biggest welterweights in the division by wingspan. In contrast, Gilbert Burns is one of the smallest welterweights in the division. Remember when Gilbert Burns first came into the UFC? He was a lightweight. You can see that he fought at lightweight for a few years before the weight cut got too difficult for him, and then he decided to make the permanent move up to welterweight. But you can see he had a good number of fights at lightweight, and yeah, a lot of fights at lightweight, which means what we've got here is, you know, Gilbert Burns, who's one of the smallest welterweights in the division, a former lightweight, fighting Chimaev, who's one of the biggest welterweights in the division and could be fighting in middleweight or even light heavyweight. So size matters in MMA. We've got weight classes for a reason, and I would... Oh, the camera's dropped again. Sorry, guys. There we go. We've got weight classes for a reason. Size matters in MMA, and I would expect Chimaev to be a lot bigger and a lot more physically imposing than Gilbert Burns on Saturday night. Now, you never really know how they match up in terms of size till we see him at either the press conference on Thursday or the ceremonial weigh-ins on Friday. But Chimaev is likely to have a bit of a size advantage here. And we also know he's very physically imposing, very physically strong with his grappling control as well, which will be helped by his length and his size, because he's got long old limbs that you can use to get to that body lock, control you and tie you up. Now, this is a really interesting matchup because both these guys are primarily grapplers. We've seen Chimaev has crushing grappling control from that combat sambo base, and we've obviously seen Gilbert Burns, very, very high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner. So Burns is going to be able to cause Chimaev problems on the ground in ways that we've never really seen Chimaev tested before, which does make this an interesting fight. But if I'm being brutally honest with you, right from the very beginning, I feel this is a test that Chimaev is going to pass with flying colours. There are some people out there that are like, you know, how can Chimaev be such a big favourite? He hasn't fought anyone. It's absolute madness how someone like, you know, John Phillips wasn't as big of an underdog as Gilbert Burns. But I watch a lot of MMA, right? So I watch 20 to 30 hours of MMA a week. I've been doing this for 15 years. I've been watching 20 to 30 hours of fight footage every single week for 15 years now. And I've never seen anyone move on the ground like Chimaev. You talk about whatever amazing MMA grapplers you want. Matt Hughes, GSP, Khabib, whoever you want to talk about on the ground. None of them do the things that I've seen Chimaev do. And some people will be like, it's because he hasn't fought anyone good, right? The low level of grapplers he's fought up until this point in his career have made Chimaev look good. But I really disagree with that. I don't think you need to see a fighter face a certain style or a certain level of opponent to be able to make an assessment about how good they're likely to be. Because if you watch enough MMA, you can tell how good someone is likely to be just by the way they move in the octagon, by the things that they do. And while we haven't seen tons of footage available on Chimaev because he's made quick work of everyone that he's faced, and while he has only fought a very low level of opponent, this guy is just unbelievable. He's absolutely incredible, and I think he's got the potential to be the greatest fighter of all time. He's the best MMA grappler I've ever seen. And the reason why I have such high praise for this guy is because he never makes a mistake, ever. He always does the optimum thing at all times and is always 2 or 3 steps ahead of his opponent. So, I make a lot of money live betting on UFC. It's how I make my living. And during UFC fights, I also commentate UFC fights from a betting perspective for people within my community. And when I'm providing live betting commentary to people in my community, I'm looking into the future. I'm not focusing on what is happening in the moment and breaking down and describing what is happening in the moment. I'm looking at what's happening in the moment and using that to give me clues as to what is likely to happen, in a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 10 minutes time. What happens in most fights that I'm commentating is I will know what a fighter should be doing next before they do it, right? They will always be lagging behind me because I have got the luxury of being sat at home on my fat ass on the sofa, not working hard, with great camera angles, perfect lighting, and I can see exactly what positions the fighters are in, so I can make a very quick assessment on what they should do next. I'm not tired like the fighters are. I'm not hurt like the fighters are. I'm not under pressure like the fighters are. And so I can think faster than they can, because they've got to systematically work through stages and processes, go from step to step to step. Chimaev is the only guy I can think of ever who is like faster than me. As soon as I think, next he's going to do this, he's done it before I can even think of it. Chimaev does the optimum thing all the time, every time, without exceptions. When you talk about positions in MMA, grappling in particular, a lot of the time it's map and a series of stages, and for every action there is a reaction. Chimaev is always ahead. It's a very difficult thing for me to describe, but I've never seen a grappler like Chimaev. He's unbelievable. Never seen anything like it, and because of that I'm so high on him. I'm probably mumbling, I'm probably not making sense, you're probably not really understanding what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to convey to you he is very fucking good. Don't be one of these guys that's he hasn't fought anyone, there's value on Burns. We'll see. I think it will surprise a lot of people how easily Chimaev makes this fight look on Saturday. And we'll talk a little bit about the strike, a little bit about the minutiae of how these two guys match up from a technical point of view, right? It's very difficult to assess how they match up on the feet because we haven't seen a lot of Chimaev striking. He death shotted Gerald Meerschaert within a few seconds, but that doesn't tell us much. The majority of Chimaev's fights have taken place on the ground, and that's a big part of what I like about him. A lot of grapplers get themselves into trouble because they try to strike too much, but Chimaev understands that his strengths are on the ground, So Chimaev doesn't usually waste much time striking. As soon as the fight starts, very early on, he looks to drag his opponents to the ground where he's just impossible to deal with. So we don't know a lot about Chimaev's striking, and this is probably Burns' best opportunity to win this fight, because we've never even really seen Chimaev punched in the face. So, maybe he's chinny, maybe he panics when under pressure or hurt on the feet. Burns is a decent striker. We saw him wobble Kamaru Usman early, in his title fight against Usman. He beat the brakes off Tyron Woodley. He knocked Damian Maia out. I know Woodley and Maia are obviously, in the later stages of their career, but Burns has got hands, right? Burns is a dangerous striker. If the fight stays on the feet, who knows what could happen. It's probably Burns' best chance of winning. Now, at this stage, there will be some people watching this video that's like, this guy's crazy. Gilbert Burns is an elite Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, and this idiot from Wales is telling me that Chimaev is going to make light work of him. And I just really think he is, if I'm being honest with you. If you look at all the high-level combat sambo grapplers that we've had, over the last few years, guys like Arman Tazrukian, guys like Islam Makhachev, guys like Khamzat Chimaev. When you look at all these guys, right, how much success have guys with a base in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu had against them? Like zero, right? How did Joel Alvarez's submission game work out for him against Arman Tazrukian a few weeks back? How did that fight go, right? The difference between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and combat sambo is combat sambo focuses a lot on position and control. And there's certain positions that you can put high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners in where they can't hurt you. And Chimaev is very good at taking those positions. If you get into top position and establish half guard, there's not a lot that a high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner can do to you from that position. They need to recover guard first before they can attack you with submissions. And if you just get to the body lock and just control them and wear on them from that body lock position, aside from maybe rolling for a leg, again, they're all out of options. And these are two positions we see Chimaev go to and utilize a lot. So the reason why I think Chimaev is going to have a lot of success on the ground in this matchup is because Chimaev is a guy that sticks to the basics and focuses on position over submission, position and control. And his strength, his physicality, his tightness of technique means he's got crushing grappling control. Very difficult to shake off, difficult to break his body lock grip, it's difficult to scramble away from him. He's so physically imposing. And when you look at Gilbert Burns' style of grappling, it's all about fast jiu-jitsu. It's about attacking with submissions, forcing crazy scrambles, being very offensive. It's not based on position. There are two different types of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner that we see in the UFC. There's control and position-based ones like a Rani Yaya or a Damian Maia. And then there's fast offense-based Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners like a Gilbert Burns or a Charles Oliveira, where they're very dangerous with their submissions, but their grappling control, not so much. That's the easiest style of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for Chimaev to face, because guys like Burns will give up takedowns very easily. Burns isn't, really bothered about defending takedowns. He's more than willing to go to the ground because he wants to be on his back attacking with submissions. That's going to be a big issue against someone like Chimaev, who can put Burns in positions which neutralizes the threat of Burns' submission game. So on the ground, I think Chimaev is going to do really well. This is also a good fight for Chimaev if it goes to the ground, because Burns is one of these guys that slows down a lot as fights wear on. If you go back and watch Burns' entire career, he's never gone out there and put a crazy pace on someone and out-grappled them for 15 minutes. Even if you look at Burns' fight against Stephen Thompson, he was looking to use his grappling to steal rounds towards the end of rounds against Stephen Thompson, and then using the rest of the fight to conserve energy on the feet. Burns doesn't have a good enough gas tank to go hard and grapple hard for 15 minutes. And as soon as you start to make Gilbert Burns grapple a little bit, he gets very, very worn down, which is the complete opposite of Chimaev, who doesn't appear to get tired or ever slow down. So it's a real bad fight for Burns, because while he may make life difficult for Chimaev early on, he may, make it difficult for Chimaev to control him because of how scrambly he is on the ground. If Chimaev can just hang in there in that first round and wear Burns down a little bit, I think Burns is going to be too tired to stop Chimaev's dominant offensive wrestling in rounds 2 and 3. I really think this could get ugly for Burns in rounds 2 and 3. Don't be surprised if you see Burns get submitted in this fight. And it's not going to be because Burns wasn't skilled enough to defend himself. It's likely just going to be because Burns is going to be too tired to defend himself after the pressure and the pace that Chimaev is going to look to put on him. So, from a betting point of view, this fight is not that interesting to me. I think Chimaev is going to win pretty dominantly and shock a lot of people who are still doubting this guy. I think he's going to make light work of Burns, and I think he's going to do it in dominant, decisive fashion. And if you're not on the Chimaev train yet, I think you will be after Saturday night. The problem is, if you look at his odds, there's really not much upside in betting Chimaev at these odds. In order to get any value on Chimaev, you've got to give him a better than 85% chance of winning. It's very difficult to do. There's lots of ways he can lose this fight. Maybe he gets disqualified. Maybe he has a bad weight cut and underperforms. Maybe he throws a leg kick and breaks his leg. Maybe Burns catches him with a crazy swiping strike and cuts him really bad and the doctor stops it. Maybe he gets flash KO'd. Maybe he does get submitted. There's lots of ways he can lose this. So it's very difficult to cap anyone in MMA at better than 85% with how crazy a sport this is. So Chimaev is not interesting to me. But at the same time, this is a really bad stylistic matchup for Gilbert Burns. I know we haven't seen a lot of Chimaev striking, but he's such an amazing grappler that if ever he did get into trouble on the feet, I think he's just going to be able to drag Burns to the ground anyway and cause Burns big trouble on the ground there. So, I understand why some people would bet Burns this weekend and find value on them, but value on him. But I personally feel like if you bet Burns, you're putting your money in a lot of danger this weekend, and that's not for me. So I'm going to pass on this fight. So I hope you found that useful. Don't forget to leave a like on the video. Subscribe if you haven't already. Because it's a long one, man, going into a lot of depth on these fights. We're going to go into a lot of depth on the next one as well. Because we're going to be breaking down the fight between Aljamain Sterling and Peter Yan. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that we're dealing with another big favourite here. Peter Yan is currently around about a 1.21 favourite, which is going to be minus 476 for an implied probability of 83%. And if we take a look at the odds on, where is our guy Aljamain? There he is. He is currently around an average of 4.70, which is plus 370 for an implied probability of 21%. Now, I'm really, really salty here because I was one of the guys that felt Peter Yan would cause Aljamain Sterling big problems in their first fight. And as a result, I bet Peter Yan. If we just type in Peter Yan's name here, you can see that I bet 2 units on Peter Yan to beat Aljamain Sterling in their first fight. And by the third round, I was already counting my money. I cannot believe that I took a loss on this. But look at the odds that we originally got on Peter Yan. He was a 1.91, minus 110, in that even money odds range, and it was clear that Yan was going to be a difficult stylistic matchup for Sterling, and we all saw what happened. So I'm really annoyed because not only did I take a 2-unit loss here, which should have been around about a 2-unit winner, but now I don't get any opportunity to put a dent in that loss because everyone's woken up to how good how good Peter Yan is now, how difficult of a stylistic matchup he is for Sterling, and the odds are obviously a lot different. So it just goes to show how off the odds were in the first fight, and how you can find a lot of value betting on MMA if you're willing to put the work in and do the research. And the odds on Yan in their first fight was absolutely crazy. It's just a shame that they didn't stay at those odds, because I would be going huge on Yan this weekend. But like I always say, you've got to let the odds do the work for you. And while Yan was a very good bet in this odds range, because odds of 1.91 carry an implied probability of 52%, and you'd have to have been a dumbass not to give Peter Yan a better than 52% chance of beating Sterling in their first fight. So even though it was easy to find value on Yan in this odds range, finding value on him in this odds range giving him a better than 83% chance of winning. It's a lot more difficult to do. And at those odds, Petr Yan is not interesting to me at all as a bet, even though I do think he wins this fight pretty comfortably, pretty dominantly, and causes Sterling, big problems once again. So we've all seen how their first fight played out. So a big part of what I'm going to be focusing on in this breakdown is what may have changed since their first fight. Because obviously if both guys show up and perform like they did in their first matchup, it's very difficult to see a realistic scenario in which Aljamain Sterling could win this fight. So like I say, what I'm going to be focusing on here is what are the chances that things have changed, right? So if you take a look at the tail of the tape, Aljamain Sterling's 32 years old, 5'7" with a 71-inch reach. Petr Yan's 29 years old, 5'7" with a 67-inch reach. Both guys roughly about the same age, roughly about the same size. Sterling does have a 4-inch reach advantage over Yan, but we've already seen in their first fight it didn't help him that much. Yan is such a high-level striker, he's such a good boxer that he was able to negate, that reach advantage that Sterling had just by getting inside and boxing him up. Sterling does fight long with his kicks, but obviously his boxing's not the best, so doesn't make best use of that reach advantage on the feet. The reach is useful in grappling positions where Sterling can use those really long limbs to get nice tight deep body locks and jump on his opponent's necks and stuff. But on the feet it doesn't help Sterling too much. So the format that I'm going to follow for this breakdown video is I'm going to talk about how these guys match up from a striking point of view. We're going to talk about how they match up from a grappling point of view. Then we're going to talk about things that may have changed from their first fight, which could lead to potentially different outcomes this time around. So if the fight stays on the feet, this is obviously a very difficult fight for Aljamain Sterling. He is primarily a grappler. Petr Yan is one of the best strikers in the UFC, ultra high level boxer, and we know as soon as Petr Yan starts to find his range, he is an absolute nightmare. What is very scary about Yan is that he also appears to be getting better from fight to fight. I cannot tell you how highly I rate Corey Sandhagen. I think Corey Sandhagen is absolutely brilliant. I think he's an excellent bantamweight and a very, very high level MMA striker. And yet Petr Yan went out there, absolutely dominated Sandhagen and beat the brakes off him. We also saw how competitive the fight between Sandhagen and Dillashaw was. Dillashaw, one of the best bantamweights in the history of the sport, if not the best, and yet Yan went out there, totally outclassed Sandhagen and dominated, which shows just how good of a striker Yan is. That was the best performance of Yan's career for me, and it showed that even at this stage in his career, even after 18 pro fights, Yan is still making big improvements from fight to fight. So on the feet, Sterling's in a lot of trouble. Another reason why he's in a lot of trouble on the feet, not just because Yan is the superior striker from a technical point of view, but also because we know Sterling is one of these guys that does slow down as fights wear on. Sterling doesn't have a bad gas tank, but he does become flatter as fights wear on, which means his output drops, he becomes a bit easier to hit, and so the longer the fight goes, the more Yan is going to be able to cause him trouble in this one. So, on the feet, doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out Sterling's in a lot of trouble here. Now, when it comes to grappling, if you go back and watch their first fight, early on, Sterling had a decent amount of success with his wrestling. And there's no doubt that Sterling is a much better grappler than Petr Yan. Petr Yan's a good grappler himself, but Sterling's a very, very high-level submission grappler, very strong, very physically imposing. And he was able to drag Petr Yan down. The problem is, it takes a lot of energy to take someone like Petr Yan down, because Yan's got really good takedown defense. So you've got to be very persistent with the takedown, use a lot of chain wrestling, and exert a lot of energy. And when you do take Yan to the ground, which is possible to do, it's very difficult to hold him down, because he's very, very scrambly and very good at working his way back up to his feet. So you have to exert a lot of energy to take him down, and then a lot of energy to keep him down. And this is the biggest issue with Aljamain Sterling. We already spoke in the Gilbert Burns versus Khamzat Chimaev breakdown about how Burns is a very, very high-level grappler that slows down as fights wear on, and he's in this awkward position where he can't fight to his biggest strength, which is his grappling, for very long, because the more he grapples, the more tired he gets. And Aljamain Sterling has exactly the same issue in this fight, where grappling is his best path to victory here against Yan. But the problem is, the more he grapples, the more tired he's going to get, which is going to make him even less effective of a grappler and more vulnerable on the feet. So Aljamain Sterling's in this horrible position in this fight, same as Gilbert Burns, where he needs to grapple to win, but the more he grapples, the less likely it is that he's going to win unless he manages to submit Peter Yan. So it's a horrible stylistic matchup for Sterling, standing up and on the ground. And, you know, if neither guy does anything different, you'd expect Yan to be very comfortable and dominate this matchup just like he dominated the first. But this is a new fight. This is a new day. This is a rematch. And things can change. And what I'm going to talk about now is what may have changed since their first fight, which could lead to a different outcome, you know, this time around in the rematch. And the example that I want to use to make an interesting point here is the third fight between Deiveson Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno. Because if you go and watch the second fight between Moreno and Figueiredo, Moreno was very dominant. He completely ran through Figueiredo and made light work of him. You know, took Figueiredo down easily and beat him up on the ground and easily outstruck Figueiredo on the feet. And then in the third fight, Figueiredo was much more competitive everywhere. He didn't slow down like he did in the second and the first fight. You know, Figueiredo performed at a decent level across the entire 5 rounds. And you can see a much different performance from Figueiredo. Figueiredo was one of these guys that, going into that first and second fight against Moreno, Figueiredo was used to just going out there, landing that big right hand and knocking his opponents 8 feet across the octagon, right? Every single time he touched Joseph Benavidez, Benavidez went down. So going into the first and second fight against Moreno, Figueiredo was full of confidence, very confident in his power, and didn't feel anyone in the division would be able to take his best shots. But Moreno did. And all Figueiredo really brought to the table in that first and second fight was he just marched forward, loaded up on that big right hand, and looked to knock Moreno out. And when that didn't work, when Moreno weathered the early storm, you know, when he took his best shots, not only did Figueiredo fade physically by getting tired, but he also faded mentally. And we also saw how easy the second fight was for Moreno. But then in the third fight, Figueiredo realised that he can't just come out, load up on the right hand and expect to knock Moreno out. He's got to be prepared for a 25-minute war of attrition. And he was. Instead of loading up so much on that big right hand, we saw Figueiredo working the jab, throwing, you know, less energy-intensive volume strikes, chipping away with leg kicks. And even though for the majority of the fight, Figueiredo was outstruck, he was able to keep it relatively close so that when he did land those big right hands, those were the moments in the round that the judges remembered. And Figueiredo, because he paced himself better and spread his output out better across the 5 rounds, he was also able to deal with the threat of Moreno's wrestling a lot better because he had more energy to defend himself in grappling positions. On top of that, he had a much better weight cut than usual. You know, it's that old saying, right? It's the definition of madness to continue to do the same thing and expect different results. Throughout Figueiredo's entire career, he put himself through a brutal weight cut and always looked like death at the weigh-ins. And that probably cost him in the first 2 fights against Moreno, where late on in those fights, or late on in the first fight, he looked very tired, very sloppy, and he obviously slowed down, you know, very early in the second fight. In the third fight, he got a nutritionist, he managed his diet and his weight better throughout camp, and that enabled him in the third fight to perform much better throughout that matchup for longer. So if you look at the second fight between Figueiredo and Moreno, it's very dominant for Moreno, and after watching that, you'd be looking at it thinking, you know, this third fight's easy for Moreno. You know, what could Figueiredo possibly do to change the outcome of this third fight? But we saw that Figueiredo changed a lot, and he really learned from the mistakes that he made throughout his career and in that second fight. Improved a lot of those mistakes, and we all saw a very different outcome and a very different performance in that third fight. To reach the highest level of anything in life, you've got to be very, very good at learning from your mistakes. And, you know, every time you get knocked back, learning from your mistakes, getting better and improving. As a professional gambler, I've had to do this countless times over the last 15 years on this journey I'm on. I still do it every week. Every single week I still review all my bets, and I'm constantly tweaking to try and find areas that I can improve and get better in. And MMA fighters are no different, right? The ones that reach the highest level of the sport are going to be very good at learning from their mistakes, and Figueiredo showed that. But while Figueiredo was learning from his mistakes in the second fight and moving in a very positive direction, Moreno was moving in the opposite direction, because we saw a very different side of Moreno leading up to that third fight and in the third fight, where earlier in his career he was a very humble guy. He had aspirations of being a UFC champion, and he's just I'm not saying that he's not a likable guy or anything like that, but there was a different vibe from Moreno prior to winning the title and after winning the title, where going into that second matchup, he was very, very confident that he was going to go out there and smoke Figueiredo. And this was reflected in the third fight. Leading up to the second fight, Moreno was young, hungry, just had that desire to become a UFC champion. And when he made light work of Figueiredo in the second fight and he won that title and had that belt, I feel he did get a little bit complacent. He got overconfident and he didn't show Figueiredo as much respect as he should have done. You saw that in the fight, because his performance in the third fight was very different in the second. Instead of Moreno chipping away at Figueiredo with his volume strikes, his jabs, his leg kicks, we saw him get into a lot more big exchanges with Figueiredo, and he was looking to get inside on Figueiredo and knock him out. Moreno was loading up big time on that right hand, and because of that, he enabled Figueiredo to play the role of Matador, chip away at him, rack up volume, and essentially use the same strategy in the third fight that Moreno had used against him in the second fight. So Moreno was overconfident. He thought he could just go in there and smoke Figueiredo, and he also thought that as the fight went on, Figueiredo would get tired and then he could really put it on him. But Figueiredo didn't. He'd made a lot of improvements. So you saw two fighters move in very different directions from the first fight. Moreno won dominantly in the second fight, and as a result of that got overconfident and complacent and didn't perform well in the third fight, where you saw Figueiredo go back to the drawing board, really learn from his mistakes and improve a lot. That is relevant in the context of this matchup, because both these guys are under no illusions as to what the other brings to the table. Sterling spent almost 20 minutes in the octagon with Peter Yan. He's felt him out. He's felt his power. He's felt his physicality. He knows how difficult he is to take down and hold down. So Sterling knows the mountain he has to climb this weekend. And I'm very sure that Sterling's gone back to the drawing board and has done everything he can to learn from his mistakes, learn from the weaknesses that cost him in that first fight, and has done all he can to improve. Peter Yan, on the other hand, believes he should be champion, believes he won the first fight, and isn't showing Sterling any respect at all. He's coming into this fight very confident, to the extent where he's even inviting other fighters to be in his corner. And you've got to question if that lack of respect that he's showing Sterling and that overconfidence could cost him, could result in this fight being closer than the first one. I'm not saying Sterling's going to go out there and dominate Yan. I'm not saying there's going to be big changes to how this one plays out. But with Yan demonstrating a lot of the same behaviours that Moreno did, the overconfidence, the lack of respect for his opponent, are there things that Sterling could do, which is difficult to foresee now, that could make this a close competitive matchup? You certainly can't rule it out, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the third Figueiredo and Moreno fight is a cautionary tale of fighters that can learn from their mistakes and improve in a short space of time, and how overconfidence can get you into trouble. So it's going to be very interesting to see if there's anything different this time. Maybe Yan wins even more dominantly than usual, but it's something to think about as we go into this matchup this weekend. It's a great fight. It's an exciting fight. I bet Yan in the first matchup. I think he does extremely well against Sterling again and wins, but with him being a big favourite, I can't bet him at these odds. So this one is an easy pass for me. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think about this fight as we go into the final one. So we're now going to talk about the main event between Alexander Volkanovski and the Korean Zombie Chan Sung Jung. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, it's another matchup which isn't the most interesting from a betting point of view. It does feature a big favourite in Volkanovski, who is a good, is a bad stylistic matchup for Korean Zombie. So the average odds available on Volkanovski at the moment are about 1.14, which is minus 714 for an implied probability of 88%. And if we take a look at the odds on Korean Zombie, he is around an average of 6.20, which is going to be plus 520 for an implied probability of 16%. Now, we've already spoken in the case of Chimaev and Yan why it's very difficult to bet fighters, as really heavy favourites in MMA because of all the crazy things that can happen. And obviously this applies to Volkanovski as well. So he is not at all interesting to me from a betting point of view, even though I do think he does very well this weekend and beats Korean Zombie. So really we're just looking in this breakdown as to whether Korean Zombie is going to be worth a bet or not. So we start off by taking a look at the tail of the tape on this one. Volkanovski is 33 years old, 5'6" with a 71.5-inch reach. And the Korean Zombie is 35 years old, 5'7" with a 72-inch reach. So both guys about the same size and about the same age. What's really cool about this fight for Volkanovski is that a lot of the time the guys he's facing are a lot bigger than he is. Whereas this will be one of those situations where he really gets to fight someone around about the same size as him. So usually Volkanovski's a lot smaller than his opponents. Here, not so much, which is pretty cool. And we could see an even better version of Volkanovski as a result of both these guys being about the same size, with Volkanovski having to overcome a huge size disadvantage like he usually has to. So in terms of how these two guys match up on the feet, this is a very good stylistic matchup when it comes to striking for Volkanovski, but also a bit of a dangerous one. So there are things that Volkanovski does very well, which are likely to cause Korean Zombie big trouble. The first weapon that Volkanovski's got, which is likely to cause Zombie big trouble, are his leg kicks. Volkanovski is very, very good at chipping away and hammering at that lead leg of his opponent. This is super important in the context of this fight, because Korean Zombie fights like a zombie, right? That's how he got the nickname. Zombie likes to plod forward, put a lot of pressure on his opponents, but he is quite flat-footed and does stand heavy on the lead leg. As a result of that, Korean Zombie's lead leg is going to be a sitting duck to the vicious leg kicks of Volkanovski. Now, Korean Zombie is a tough guy that could definitely take a lot of damage, but we saw how ignoring the leg kick, not addressing the leg kick, can get you into a lot of trouble in Volkanovski's first fight against Max Holloway. In that first fight, Holloway allowed Volkanovski to just chip away at that lead leg, and before Holloway knew what had happened, he'd taken, irrecoverable damage to that lead leg and was forced to have to switch stances and stuff, which really threw Holloway off his game. So the leg kicks are going to be absolutely massive for Volkanovski in this matchup, and it's something that I feel is going to be a big issue for Korean Zombie. Now, what is interesting is that Korean Zombie has been training with Henry Cejudo for this fight, and that's super important because leg kicks were a big part of Henry Cejudo's game. Demetrius Johnson caused Henry Cejudo big problems with the leg kicks, and then Henry Cejudo went and learned all about leg kicks, and then built them into his arsenal and was able to cause guys like Dominic Cruz and Marlon Moraes big problems with his own leg kicks. So it's very interesting how that is one of the biggest weapons that Volkanovski can use in this matchup, but maybe Henry Cejudo has got a plan for dealing with them. Maybe he's helped coach Korean Zombie on some tactics that will, negate some of the threat that Volkanovski poses to him with leg kicks. I don't know what that could be, but it is very interesting how leg kicks are one of Cejudo's biggest weapons, and now Korean Zombie is training with Cejudo for this fight. Now, on the feet, Volkanovski not only has a big advantage with leg kicks, but he's also a very high volume striker. Very accurate, good footwork, good movement, good defensively. So as a high volume of strikes, has a good jab. That means he stands a great chance of outworking Korean Zombie, who throws a much lower volume of strikes and instead looks to load up and catch you with that big power right hand. This is one of those fights where Volkanovski should be winning every minute of the striking, every minute of the stand-up. because the volume that Volkanovski puts on his opponents is not a volume that Korean Zombie is going to be able to match. However, we do know Zombie has big power in his right hand and carries legit one-shot KO power. We know Volkanovski is very tough, very durable, he's got a good chin, but we also know that chin isn't bulletproof. We saw him dropped against Holloway, and we know that Korean Zombie is one of the biggest power punchers in the division. So while this is a very good stylistic matchup for Volkanovski, and if it goes the distance, Volkanovski probably outstrikes Zombie by a very wide margin, it's dangerous for Volkanovski because on the feet, it only takes one shot, and Zombie's very dangerous. Zombie's also one of these guys who's not afraid to eat a shot, to give a shot. And so it's a good stylistic matchup on the feet for Volkanovski, but it's also kind of dangerous because Zombie does have that kill or be killed style, and it only takes one shot in 25 minutes to land, and Volk could be in a lot of trouble. So when it comes to grappling, this fight gets a lot more interesting because Volkanovski is a strong, powerful, physically imposing, athletic guy that hasn't had any problems on the ground against anyone that he's ever faced. But he also hasn't really been put in any bad positions on the ground. And one thing that is maybe worth considering when it comes to Volkanovski is that he does train at a gym that is pretty well known for producing bad MMA grapplers. If we think about City Kickboxing, some of the fighters that have come out of there, Israel Adesanya, Brad Riddell, you look at Dan Hooker, Kai Kara France. These guys have pretty bad takedown defense and very, very low level ground games. Now, Alexander Volkanovski could be the outlier to that. He could be the unicorn that breaks that trend and breaks that rule. But he also might not be. Perhaps Volkanovski isn't very skilled on the ground, but he makes up for it with his strength, his power, and his athleticism. I feel that's quite likely what's going on. Now, some of you may say, but what about the Ortega fight, right? Ortega had him in some really bad positions. He was able to fight through them. And I think there's two things that could be at play there. The first is, like I said, Volkanovski's very tough, very durable. There's no quitting him. He's very strong. So that helped him kind of work his way through those bad positions that Ortega put him in. But on top of that, Ortega also put him in those bad positions pretty late on in the fight when he'd already taken a lot of damage and had already been worn down quite a bit by Volkanovski. Would Volkanovski been able to have survived those positions earlier in the matchup? I'm not so sure. So when it comes to Volkanovski's grappling, there could be opportunities there for Korean Zombie, because I have a feeling that Volkanovski's grappling success comes more from his athleticism than his technique. Whereas we know Korean Zombie is a very, very dangerous submission grappler that can catch you in a lot of bad positions, and his gas tank is very good as well. So I do think if this fight goes to the ground, Korean Zombie could have an advantage, but it's difficult to say because there's not tons of footage available on guys having a lot of success taking Volkanovski down and putting him in bad positions. He's usually the aggressor, he's usually the hammer, taking other guys down and putting them in bad positions. Korean Zombie did show more of a willingness to grapple in his last fight against Dan Ige though, and I do think things could get interesting if he were to come into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan. But ultimately, to summarise, this is a really bad stylistic matchup for Korean Zombie. On the feet, he's likely to get outstruck by a wide margin, and while he may land a bomb and knock Volkanovski out, the jab, the volume, the footwork, the movement, the defense, the leg kicks of Volkanovski are likely to be too much for Korean Zombie to handle. On the ground, I do think there's a lot more opportunity for Korean Zombie to win this fight. However, Volkanovski is small, compact, muscular, strong, physically imposing, scrambly, tough as nails, and a tough nut to crack. It won't be easy for Korean Zombie to take Volkanovski down and hold him down for long enough to have any impact on the outcome of this matchup. And so for that reason, it's a very difficult fight for betting. You've got to favour Volkanovski here, quite heavily, but his odds are just too bad to be able to bet him. As the biggest favourite on the card, there's just no way to bet Volkanovski. You're not getting a good risk to reward ratio on these odds. But at the same time, I'm not interested in betting on Korean Zombie. It's a really bad stylistic matchup for him, and I think Volkanovski is going to win a very high percentage of the time. There you go, we are done. That was a long one. 5 deep fights for us to dive into on this breakdown video. Went into a lot of depth, but hope you found the information useful. If you did, please hit the like button. Please also leave a comment, let me know what you think about this video, and subscribe if you haven't already. And above all else, check out my website, MABettingTips.com. Link in the description below. Talk to me in there every day. Yeah, man. Sure you'll like it. I'm out of breath. I need a drink. Thank you for watching. Take care, guys. Love you all. I'll see you in next week's video. Nice one, guys. Bye.